I'm doing a video as my history project because it's something I am decent at. History is an interesting thing, and I am here to teach you about it. Let's begin. We start off with the Mongols and the Silk Road. The Mongols at the time were a very powerful empire, and it was this big. At the time, the ruler of Mongolia was Genghis Khan. Not the most moral emperor, but the most successful. Now, when you have a massive empire, you have a massive sphere of influence. And one of those influences was the Silk Road. Our main topic for this unit because of its significance. The Silk Road was a large trade route, connecting the two most populated continents at the time, Europe and China. This was big because they didn't have airplanes or cargo ships. All they had was horses, camels, and rowboats, basically. Cultures and goods spread throughout Europe and Asia because of the Silk Road. Cotton, silk, and other fabrics, along with furs, brought from Asia to Europe. Europe brought honey, wine, olive, and slaves. Ideas and religions passed through. Christianity spread to Asia, and some Asian leaders even converted to Christianity, such as Möngke Khan. There were also trade routes such as the Trans-Saharan Trade Network and the Indian Ocean Trade Network. The Trans-Saharan Trade Network was in Africa, so they mostly used camels to transport goods. The main goods they transported were gold, ebony, ivory, slaves, salt, textile, copper, and brass. This was very important to Africa because Africa at the time was a bunch of small tribes who didn't have that much connection to the outer world, so having a trade route that connected them was very important. The last main trade route I will talk about is the Indian Ocean Trade Route. This is the only one that mainly traveled by water. The Indian Ocean Trade Route connected parts of Africa and most of Asia all together, meaning it was important because it connected Asia and Africa, with the transitive property stating that it connected Europe and Africa. But then Europe had the medieval age. During the medieval age, everybody was extremely religious. If you said anything against the church, you were tortured. So you could expect that when they learned people in the Middle East weren't Christian, they went insane. So you could expect that when people learned that people in the Middle East weren't Christian, they went insane. The people in northwestern Europe thought they had to do the work of God and get rid of Islam. So they rounded up a bunch of poor, bored young people to go fight in raids against the Muslim cities, like Jerusalem, and for some reason, also attacking the Byzantine Empire a little bit. These attacks in the Middle East were called the Crusades, in which soldiers wore armor with religious symbols on them, to symbolize the Christian superiority in their minds. They ransacked Jerusalem and took it over. During this raid, many Muslims and Jews were killed, and even after that, they executed non-Christians found there. This lasted from about 1095 to 1291 AD, and at the end of it, some people who were soldiers ended up staying in the Middle East, some of them even setting up trading markets and becoming traders, who helped ideas spread from Europe to the Middle East, and from the Middle East to Europe. About 1,000 years later, a disease started to spread in China, one from the flea on a rat. The disease was known as the Black Plague. People went absolutely bonkers. They had never seen anything like this before. People needed a reason. Maybe a curse from God for committing sin? Maybe people were worshipping the wrong gods? These are all things people believed. But they also wanted a scapegoat, someone to blame. And who is that one group of people that is always blamed for everything? That's right, the Jews. They blamed the Jews. Again. They burned down their homes and killed their families, and basically just got rid of the Jewish people. They blamed the Jews by making them confess to poisoning wells by torturing them until they confessed, in which they most likely didn't. They just didn't like torture. They massacred Jews in multiple cities. Wait, give me a second. I have a list. Toulon, France. Barcelona, Spain. Erfurt. Basel. Aragorn, Flanders, Strasbourg Valentine's Day Massacre, Frankfurt am Main, Mainz, Cologne. It definitely sounds like I'm making this up, but search up persecution of Jews during the Black Death. Speyer, Hansa townships in the Baltic coast. There was also this guy named King Casimir III who gave refuge to Jews and tried to protect them. And then 20 years later in Brussels, they just wiped out the entirety of the Belgian Jewish community. Lots of Jews were killed, and it didn't work to stop the Black Death. The Black Death lasted about for 7 years, and then just kind of vanished because it got colder, meaning that the flea it carried just died off. Lots of people died and had a huge effect on Europe. People were starting to get more curious about the world around them, and that led to the Renaissance era. The main thing that led to the Renaissance era was the ability to print. You see, books had to be written down and copied by scribes. lives, and writing down an entire book by hand is extremely time consuming. It took about 5 months to write one book, and because of that, it cost a lot of money. So only the very rich could buy books, so only they could really be educated beyond a second grade level. When printing came around and you could just make a book in like a few days or to a few weeks, and that didn't take as long, making them cheaper and a lot easier to get. This meant that more people wanted to become educated and know more about the world outside their religion. People began learning more and pursuing the arts that isn't this baby Jesus and Mary that doesn't look like anything, even any human ever. People started drawing amazing art, focusing on the beauty of people. People didn't want to engage in themselves for art. They also wanted to learn what was inside a person and how the body worked. Originally, they thought body parts were powered by some sort of animals or mythical creatures. But when a teacher asked for some dead bodies from his town for inspection, people learned what was inside and not exactly how it worked. But they learned it wasn't animal parts. People started writing poetry, like William Shakespeare, who wrote lots of plays. Many cultures changed. Most people's way of life changed. In the Renaissance, it went from focusing on religion and work in the medieval era, and then when the Renaissance came around, people started focusing on the art and of people and technology and became better artists, using shadow and better color schemes. They even started writing plays and books. Learning made this all happen. The topic of religion wasn't completely thrown out the window in the Renaissance, though. A big turning point in the Renaissance is the Protestant Reformation. A man by the name of Martin Luther was in a flood, and he promised to God that if he survived, he would become a priest and would serve him as much as possible. Around the time that Martin was a priest, it turned out the Catholic Church was an insanely corrupt thing. They would make fake pilgrimages and make you able to pay money to go to heaven. So they would say, hey, pay 300 currency and then you can get into heaven. Priests would make money taking advantage of these people, and Martin Luther was not happy about it. So he publicly shamed the Catholic Church and they excommunicated him. Martin Luther started his own sect of Christianity called Lutheran, which became the main German sect of Christianity even up until now. Some other Protestant forms of Christianity were created, like Orthodox and Baptist. The word Protestant is derived from the word protest. Another thing that happened during this time was the Spanish Reconquista, or the Spanish Reconquest. The Spanish Reconquista is when Spain wanted to get rid of all the Muslims in Spain, because most of Spain was controlled by Muslims. When Spain wanted to get rid of them, they sparked the Granada War. The war ended in 1492 and was 770 years long. The Muslims surrendered and were forced to leave or convert. The effect of this was removing Muslims from Spain. Soon after, they also persecuted the Jews from Spain because they thought the Jews were trying to convert them. So basically, they just taxed them a lot and forced them to live in ghettos. They did the same thing to the Muslims after the war. It is related to our next story, the Columbian Exchange. Christopher Columbus sailed to the Caribbean and brought wheat, cattle, coffee beans, honey bees, onions, sugarcane, and disease. The Caribbeans gave the Spanish tobacco, pineapple, turkeys, tomatoes, potatoes, corn, peanut, beans, and many more. Yeah, this is pretty cool, apart from the diseases, until Columbus and his crew just started massacring the natives for gold and other valuables. Columbus ended up being responsible for the death of 12 to 15 million indigenous people, either from disease or his crew killing them. Now, discovering a new area of the world for them and finding lots of people there sparks a lot of new ideas, and one of those ideas was making a lot of money. The way to make all this money was through mercantilism, where you maximize your exports and minimize your imports, making your profits skyrocket. The Europeans had forced the natives to buy the products from Europe so that they could get money. This made Latin America very poor. The Europeans had also traded slaves that they got from Africa. It started out that the Europeans traded with African leaders for slaves and gave them gunpowder, but then the Europeans just got tired of trading for slaves and just started kidnapping them. The main nation to do this is Portugal, and they made a lot of money off the slave trade. The slaves were treated like animals and were brought into the Americas in terrible conditions. They were tightly packed, and many of them got sick and died. This is so horrifying that some people such as John Newton, a slave trader at the time, turned around the vessel and let the slaves go, and later wrote the popular song Amazing Grace. Slaves meant free labor, but it was immoral and bound to come back and turn against them. It did, but not yet. The natives did not like the Europeans. They conquered them and forced them to buy European products and follow their religion. They also forced the natives to sell goods for an extremely low price. Then the Europeans would manufacture things out of these goods and then sell it back to the natives for an extremely expensive price. This also made the natives extremely angry, and they too shall rise up soon. The Europeans also forced the natives to convert to Christianity, like they did with every single nation, the natives refused, and the Europeans, more specifically the Portuguese and the Spanish, weren't taking no for an answer. So they said, you will convert or we will kill you. That didn't happen everywhere though. In some places they were worshipped like gods, and the Spanish could just say convert to Christianity, and they did. The ones that were forced to were also not happy about it, and they were starting to get really fed up. Fed up enough to revolt, but still, not yet. The Revolutionary War had just ended, and America had taken a lot of debt to France, but America did not pay it back. So that left France pretty poor. The leaders of France didn't know what to do, so they just started taxing the poor a lot for things that didn't even make sense. Like for how many windows someone has in their house. The government got all this money and started spending it in a way that did not help the poverty situation. Like the Queen making her hair a giant hairdo that looks like a boat, instead of making sure the citizens don't starve. Taxing the poorest group of people a lot is one of the worst things to do as a leader, because it sparks an uprising pretty fast. And the French king at the time did exactly that. The citizens of France started storming outposts and raiding armories for weapons to fight the government. It didn't take that long for the citizens to have control of the government. The king and queen fled, but were spotted in a carriage near the border and were brought back to France and executed by guillotine. After that sparked a reign of terror, where the guy who promised not to become a dictator became a dictator and executed everyone that went against the revolution. So if you wanted anyone killed, you could just say that someone said something against the revolution, and then they would be executed. Executions were so common that the blade was starting to get dull, and to kill someone, they would have to drop the blade multiple times. The citizens got fed up with this and then killed the dictator and his supporters. The French Revolution was extremely violent. Remember earlier when I was talking about the slaves not liking their conditions? Yeah, that came back to screw over France. Slaves outnumbered the non-slaves in the small colony of France called Haiti, so the slaves took advantage of that and started a revolution, in which they won pretty easily because they did it at night and they vastly outnumbered the non-slaves. They put people's heads on stakes and to scare France off, but France sent reinforcements and then suppressed the revolution. But then the slaves fought back and won. This inspired other Latin American countries to rise up, mainly because of how poor they were and the fact that they hated their new social system. So they did that and took back their land. Some parts were able to successfully revolt, and some parts weren't able to and lost. Some even successfully defended against Spain and Portugal. This is all with the help of the new Haiti, because they lent weapons and money to these revolutions. Most of them weren't successful in the end, but it taught the Europeans a good lesson. I'm just kidding. In this age, there wasn't only revolutions of power. There were also revolutions with something called the Industrial Revolution, in which people started using machines for manufacturing goods. Now that goods could be made a lot cheaper and faster, more jobs were created for working in factories. When so many people became factory workers, the wage that they were paid went down, so they could still afford to pay factory workers and still make a good profit. This meant that people did not even make close to a livable wage, so they had to make everyone in the family work, including the children. The workplace was extremely dangerous, and people would get fatally injured regularly. This led to laws being made, laws against child labor, and laws against bad working conditions. My grandfather always said to me, behind every single thing is a lawsuit. But that didn't happen for a while. In the meantime, people starved and died of lung poisoning from all the fog. Good things were created, like trains, steamboats, and manufacturing machines. It did mostly end, though. Henry Ford was credited with giving workers better wages and giving them weekends so that they could have breaks. Another topic I have to go over is imperialism, or in other words, empires. The main goal in an empire is to expand, to get bigger, to gain land. And a great place to do that back then was Africa. Africa was big and full of small tribes that weren't that powerful. If they united, they would be a little more powerful, but they weren't. So the empires like Britain, France, and Belgium could just go right in and take it over easily. So they did, and they expanded their empire, using the natives as slaves, taking Africa's natural resources, and the empires fought each other for control of the continent, without asking the natives' opinion. So they fought and fought and fought for land that in certain places didn't really benefit them. They just wanted to expand their empire. Another place that they could conquer was Asia, mainly China for Britain. Now China was hard to take over because they were a bit more advanced and united, but the British were too powerful. Britain forced China to produce and give Britain a drug called opium, which is really popular. China revolted and took back its land, but soon was taken over again by the British. Now more east of this was Japan, who wanted to modernize and become more like Western civilization, so they adopted Western sports such as golf and baseball. They also started wearing Western clothing instead of traditional Japanese clothing. They got rid of the shogun and samurai system and became an empire, creating the title of Emperor Hirohito. Japan started taking over areas around it, like modern-day Korea and islands of the Pacific Ocean. This led to later joining the Axis in World War II, but we aren't there yet. World War I has to happen. So World War I started because Germany wanted to invade France for a while, but needed a reason. Luckily, an ally of France and Britain was Serbia, and Germany was allied with Austria-Hungary. Meanwhile, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was on a ride in a car and took a wrong turn, where he was shot and killed by an assassin. This made Austria-Hungary mad at Serbia because it was probably Serbia's fault, so Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and then Britain joined and France joined against Austria-Hungary, and then Germany quickly followed. The year was 1914, and this became World War I. The fighting of World War I was done in trenches, where soldiers would dig into the ground and create small bunkers so that they could have cover from enemy fire. Now, being in the trenches wasn't just dangerous because of the war going on, it was also dangerous because of the diseases and infections you got. Trench foot was a big thing, and at the time, the disease known as the Spanish flu was going around, and it was a pandemic. Lots of people caught the Spanish flu and died of it. The trenches were full of water and rats, making it extra disease infested. How trench warfare worked was the attacking side would take a bunch of soldiers and just run at the enemy with them, while the defenders would use machine guns to shoot back and kill the attackers. This would end when either the attackers got to the defending trench and kill the defenders in the trench, taking it over, or when the defenders kill or make the soldiers running at the defenders surrender, in which they would stop and wait for reinforcements, or the defenders would attack and attackers would defend, and the cycle would repeat. The USA wanted to stay neutral, but it ended up joining the war and helping the Allies. Russia had a revolution and turned communist, so it backed out of the war, leaving Britain, France, and America to fight Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Germany was winning for a while because of the terrible conditions in the trenches. It became a war of attrition. Germany tried to make a final push into Paris, but failed and started losing, and Germany surrendered in 1918. The war was over, and they created a treaty called the Treaty of Versailles, in which Germany had to give up some land, take blame for the war, and pay a lot of war reparations, as long as not have a certain amount of people in their army and not militarizing the Rhineland. Germany thought they could just cheat their way out of it by printing a bunch of money and paying the reparations with that money. Germany printed out so much money that it became basically worthless. According to my great-grandfather, he would have to take a full wheelbarrow with German marks to buy a single loaf of bread. Germany wasn't the only economy to crash. America's did too. This period was known as the Great Depression. After World War I, the soldiers in World War II didn't really know what to do. The stock market crashed in 1929 and left millions in poverty. Lots of people were evicted and were forced to eat at soup kitchens. Who knew that war would fix the American economy? In Germany, a man named Adolf Hitler took power by getting the support of the public and saying that he could fix everything. Hitler wanted someone to blame for their misfortune, and that's why they chose the Jews again. Well, Jews, gypsies, and handicapped, and the mentally impaired. Hitler wanted to get rid of all these people, and people supported him. So Hitler walked down to the Chancellor building and told the Chancellor to give him power because he had a lot of people. Hitler was handed the Chancellor and made himself the dictator in 1933. He said that the way to make Germany better was to find Lebensraum for the German living space, and he became the Time Person of the Year in 1938. Hitler also said that they needed to get rid of the Jews. According to him, they were the biggest problem in Germany, so he wanted to get rid of them. First, he put them in ghettos, then he put them in work camps, and then he killed them. But before that, Hitler wanted to get some land back that he claimed was his, so he just had his army walk right through Austria and Anschluss it, just taking it over without any resistance. Then Hitler would want Sudetenland, a province of Czechoslovakia. The Allies said yes, you can have it, to Hitler because they didn't want to go to war with him. Then Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia and the Allies did nothing. In 1939, Hitler signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union to invade Poland, and then that's when the Allies said it was enough, and they declared war on the Axis powers, who were Germany, Italy, and Japan, who had just started invading China. Italy had just gotten a new leader, Benito Mussolini, who was also a fascist, just like Hitler, and was mad at France and Britain, who promised to give Italy some land after World War I, but they didn't. Germany and the Soviet Union successfully annexed Poland. Germany needed a way to get past France, so they invaded Belgium and to get by the Maginot Line, and it was successful. Germany completely took over both Poland and France, along with the Netherlands and Belgium. Germany betrayed the Soviet Union and declared war on them. Germany was able to go through the Soviet Union pretty swiftly until it became winter. Now, Russia's winter is extremely cold and really hard to get through, but if you're Russian, you're used to it. So many German soldiers and horses died because of the cold. And for Russia and Germany, this also started to become a war of attrition. If it wasn't winter, then Germany could have just bulldozed right on through and took over the Soviet Union, mostly because the Red Army was vastly unequipped. The Soviet Union ended up winning the Battle of Stalingrad, and that was a major turning point in the Eastern Front. Over in the Pacific Ocean, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and then America joined World War II against the Axis. Meanwhile, for the Jews, they were being killed in gas chambers and murdered with guns and experimented on. It was estimated around 6 million Jews and other persecuted minorities died in the Holocaust. Over in northern France, the Americans and the British launched an invasion in Normandy and pushed back the Germans to their original borders. A little while later, in 1945, the Allies invaded Berlin and took it over, and inside Hitler's bunker, he killed himself, and Germany surrendered. Over in the Pacific Ocean again, fighting was raging on with Japan and the USA, and Japan was surrendering, so they took over China, and now we're trying to fight America. Japan did not surrender because they saw it was an honor to die in battle. So the U.S. realized that the only way to kill Japan was to attack the civilian cities. So on August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped the nuclear bomb Little Boy on Hiroshima. Then 2 days later, the Japanese didn't surrender, so the U.S. dropped another nuclear bomb called Fat Man on Nagasaki, and the Japanese surrendered, thus ending World War II. This is a long one, about 4,244 words. Don't mind the stuttering and everything.